They called it a coincidence, two pop icons unraveling in public, years apart under different headlines, but the paperwork followed the same template. The same signatures appeared in different courtrooms, and the silence afterwards sounded identical. If it was not a coincidence, then what mechanism decided when a star would be contained? The cameras captured the meltdowns, not the machinery behind them. Britney Spears and Amanda Bynes never shared a stage that mattered, yet the same invisible hands seemed to reach for both at the exact moment their independence became inconvenient. Why did the safeguards activate only after they resisted? In official timelines, the stories diverge. In the margins, they align. From a distance, the early signs looked like chaos, erratic behavior, late-night incidents, headlines engineered for consumption. Up close, the pattern was administrative. Emergency petitions filed with remarkable speed, identical language repeated across filings, evaluations scheduled before representation could respond. Observers noted how quickly autonomy was reframed as danger, dissent as instability. The question was not whether help was needed, but who defined the threshold and why it was crossed so decisively. The system had a rhythm. First came surveillance masquerading as concern. Then the public incident, amplified until restraint appeared merciful. Finally, the intervention, clean, procedural, irreversible. Each step was lawful on paper. Each step narrowed choice. Who benefited when control replaced consent? For Britney, the pivot arrived when her resistance became unpredictable to manage. For Amanda, it came when unpredictability threatened contracts still breathing. Different lives, same trigger, loss of compliance. Witnesses later described rooms that felt airless, conversations that looped, decisions already made before anyone spoke. If the outcome was predetermined, where did accountability actually live? Records show professionals acting within scope, families acting under pressure, courts acting swiftly. Records do not show the meetings before the meetings, the calls before the filings, the moment a person becomes a case. When two cases share the same procedural fingerprint, is it care or containment? Listen closely to the aftermath. Not the press conferences, but the quiet. Phones rerouted, calendars erased, voices filtered through intermediaries. The sensory details matter. The sterile brightness of offices, the hum of air conditioning during assessments, the weight of forms slid across tables without eye contact. These environments are designed to calm, yet they compress. What happens to identity inside a process that never asks what freedom costs? By the time the public asked questions, the answers had already been standardized. Coincidence remained the official explanation. But coincidence does not file motions, assign guardians, or decide when a woman's voice becomes evidence against her. If the same mechanism moved both pieces, who built it? And who decides when it stops? At first, neither woman realized she was being observed through a framework already built for containment. The concern arrived disguised as care, check-in calls, wellness questions, offers of support that felt rehearsed. Nothing overt, nothing illegal. Just enough attention to create dependency, just enough pressure to suggest instability. In Britney's case, the monitoring intensified after moments of refusal. Missed rehearsals, delayed agreements, a growing insistence on controlling her own schedule. For Amanda, it followed a similar arc. Projects paused, representatives stepping in temporarily, conversations reframed around protection. In both narratives, independence was subtly reclassified as risk. What unsettled those closest to the situations was the timing. Evaluations were arranged with unusual speed. Decisions were presented as urgent, non-negotiable. There was no space for second opinions, no allowance for context. The system moved as if it had been waiting. Who authorized that acceleration? Witnesses later described the same atmosphere. Rooms that felt overly quiet, questions that circled without answers, professionals speaking in calm tones while documenting every reaction. The sensory details repeated, fluorescent lights humming overhead, clipboards pressed tight to chests, the faint smell of disinfectant masking anxiety. These were not moments of crisis. They were moments of transition. Public narratives framed the changes as necessary interventions. Privately, both women expressed confusion about how quickly control slipped away. Phones were managed, transportation was scheduled, access was filtered. Each restriction was justified individually. Together, they formed a closed system. At what point does protection become possession? What made the pattern harder to dismiss was the paperwork. Similar clauses, similar language, similar justifications, different jurisdictions, same logic. This was not improvisation, it was protocol. And protocols are not created for one person. They are designed to be reused. By the time the headlines caught up, the mechanism was already in motion. Resistance, once visible, was now evidence. Silence, once voluntary, was now enforced. The system had completed its first phase. The question that lingered was simple and deeply unsettling. Once the process begins, how does it ever end? The breakdowns did not erupt out of nowhere. They were staged by circumstance, guided by pressure, and released into public view at precisely the right moment. In both cases, isolation preceded exposure. Support networks thinned quietly, replaced by intermediaries whose loyalty ran upward, not inward. When the fall came, it looked spontaneous. It was not. For Britney, the pressure accumulated in confined schedules and relentless scrutiny. Sleep deprivation blurred days into nights. For Amanda, the spiral followed a similar design. Canceled work, monitored movements, an increasing sense that every action was being watched. Paranoia, under these conditions, is not delusion. It is pattern recognition. When reality tightens, the mind searches for exits. The media did not discover the incidents. It received them. Cameras appeared with uncanny precision. Reports echoed the same language: concerning, erratic, out of control. These words functioned as triggers, priming the audience to accept intervention as mercy. Once labeled, behavior no longer required context. It required containment. Those moments were sensory overloads. Sirens cutting through night air, flashing lights reflecting off windshields, voices overlapping, urgent, directive. For the person at the center, time fractured. What followed felt unreal. Hands guiding, doors closing, signatures demanded. The body complied before the mind could object. Is compliance still voluntary when alternatives vanish? What the public never saw were the hours before. The conversations that escalated tension. The refusals that were documented, not heard. In both timelines, a single night became definitive, used to justify years of control. One event, endlessly replayed, replaced the complexity of a life. Psychologists later noted how crisis framing can lock perception. Once someone is seen as unstable, every reaction confirms the diagnosis. Anger becomes proof. Silence becomes proof. Even clarity becomes suspect. If every response validates the same conclusion, where is the exit? By morning, narratives were fixed, legal mechanisms engaged, guardianship structures prepared. The system did not ask whether recovery was possible without surrender. It assumed surrender was the treatment. And in that assumption, autonomy quietly expired. If these collapses were engineered to appear inevitable, then inevitability itself was the tool. The question remains: who decides when a person's worst moment defines their entire future? Once the narrative was fixed, the legal architecture moved in with precision. What appeared to be emergency measures hardened into long-term control through filings that emphasize safety while quietly transferring authority. In both cases, the language was familiar. Best interest, incapacity, protection. Terms that sounded humane yet functioned as locks. When rights are redefined as privileges, revocation becomes procedural. For Britney, conservatorship documents framed urgency as inevitability. For Amanda, similar petitions invoked stabilization, oversight, time. Different labels, identical effect. Decisions rerouted through appointed hands. The women were no longer primary agents in their own timelines. They were subjects within a managed process. If consent is assumed unnecessary, what remains of personhood? Inside the system, the days blurred. Appointments replaced choices. Requests required approval. Resistance triggered reports. The sensory world narrowed to waiting rooms and conference tables. The soft scratch of pens signing away options. The low murmur of professionals conferring just out of earshot. Calm voices delivered finality. Anxiety learned to whisper. Psychologically, the shift was profound. Hypervigilance set in. Every word felt monitored. Every reaction potentially admissible. Self-expression became dangerous. Silence became strategy. Paranoia in this environment is adaptive, an attempt to survive under total evaluation. When observation never ends, the mind internalizes the watcher. Supporters argued the measures were temporary, yet extensions followed seamlessly, justified by the very symptoms the restrictions produced. Isolation deepened distress. Distress validated control. A closed loop formed, elegant and devastating. Who breaks a cycle when the cycle defines the criteria for its own continuation? Publicly, improvement was demanded as proof of gratitude. Privately, improvement was impossible to demonstrate without autonomy. Perform wellness, and you are stable enough to comply. Fail to perform, and you confirm the need for oversight. The contradiction was absolute. There was no correct response. Records from this period emphasize compliance metrics and progress notes. They do not capture the erosion of self, the feeling of being present yet absent, heard yet untranslated. When a system measures behavior but ignores meaning, what exactly is it treating? By the time questions surfaced about duration and necessity, the structure was entrenched. Ending it would require admitting excess. Maintaining it required silence. The mechanism preferred silence. And silence, once institutionalized, is difficult to distinguish from consent. What happens to a mind when the exit depends on proving a freedom it no longer controls? As the system stabilized itself, an unexpected phenomenon emerged: reflection. Each woman began to see her experience echoed elsewhere, through headlines, through whispers, through other names passing briefly through the same machinery. It was not direct communication, it was recognition. The unsettling awareness that what felt personal was, in fact, replicable. For Britney, fragments surfaced, in the form of news clippings and court updates that mirrored earlier steps in her own case. For Amanda, the realization came later, during moments of clarity that pierced the fog, patterns aligning, phrases repeating, outcomes predicted before processes concluded. This was not paranoia feeding itself. It was the mind identifying structure. The psychological impact intensified. Identity fractured between who they were said to be, and who the system required them to perform as. The mirror effect distorted time. Past decisions were reinterpreted as symptoms. Future intentions were preemptively constrained. When every version of the self is subject to evaluation, authenticity becomes a liability. Sensory details from this phase are consistent across accounts. The dull thud of doors closing with controlled finality, the smell of recycled air, the soft glow of screens displaying schedules decided elsewhere. Days felt staged, rehearsed, safe only insofar as they were predictable. Safety, redefined as control, left no room for recovery. How does one heal in an environment that cannot tolerate uncertainty? Observers noted compliance improving alongside affect flattening. Emotions dulled, curiosity faded. The system interpreted this as success. Yet clinicians warn that emotional suppression masquerading, as stability often signals resignation, not wellness. If vitality disappears, is order truly achieved? Attempts to assert boundaries were subtle, small refusals, delayed responses, questions asked twice. Each was documented, each recalibrated the risk profile. The feedback was immediate. More oversight, tighter schedules, renewed assessments. The lesson was learned quickly. Visibility invited intervention. Withdrawal preserved equilibrium. In this phase, the women were not breaking down. They were breaking inward. The crisis had passed. The consequence remained. What lingered was the quiet terror of permanence, the fear that this version of life was no longer temporary, but the new design. If recognition reveals the system's shape, does awareness offer escape, or merely confirm the depth of the enclosure? With overt resistance no longer viable, adaptation became the only form of survival. The system did not demand silence outright. It rewarded compliance subtly. Access was granted conditionally. Privileges returned incrementally. Each concession came with an unspoken message. Normalcy was possible, but only within boundaries defined elsewhere. For Britney, public appearances resumed under strict choreography. Words vetted, movements anticipated, spontaneity discouraged. For Amanda, the path was quieter but no less constrained. Approved routines, monitored environments, a curated version of recovery presented as progress. Normal life was simulated, freedom was deferred. At what point does adaptation become erasure? Internally, a quieter struggle unfolded. Thoughts were edited before being spoken. Emotions were measured for acceptability. The mind learned to split, one part complying, another observing from a distance. This dissociation reduced conflict, but it also reduced presence. When living requires constant self-censorship, what remains authentic? The sensory landscape reinforced this discipline. Spaces felt orderly, almost serene, neutral colors, soft lighting, predictable schedules. Yet beneath the calm lay tension, a constant readiness to adjust, to not misstep. The absence of chaos was not peace. It was containment refined. Can tranquility imposed from outside ever substitute for safety felt within? Supporters pointed to improvement as evidence the system worked. Critics questioned the cost. Both sides relied on visible outcomes. Neither could access the internal calculus, the exhaustion of perpetual performance, the grief of unrealized agency. If wellness is defined only by compliance, dissent becomes pathology. Small acts of resistance persisted, invisible to records, private journals, unguarded thoughts, moments of refusal that never reached documentation. These were not rebellions. They were reminders, proof that identity had not fully surrendered. But reminders fade when reinforcement is relentless. How long can inner autonomy survive without expression? By this stage, the system no longer needed force. It had achieved normalization. Control felt routine. Dependence felt reasonable. The most effective mechanisms are those that render themselves unremarkable. If captivity feels ordinary, who recognizes it as captivity at all? And when the rules are internalized, who is the jailer, external authority, or the mind trained to anticipate it? No system is perfectly sealed. Over time, fractures appeared, not dramatic ruptures, but subtle leaks where reality slipped through. A delayed response, an unscripted sentence, a look held too long on camera. These moments were brief, easily dismissed, yet deeply destabilizing to a structure built on predictability. Control depends on consistency. Inconsistency introduces doubt. For Britney, the cracks emerged in fragments of speech that did not align with prepared narratives, comments that hinted at confinement rather than care. For Amanda, they surfaced in sudden withdrawals from visibility, choices that resisted explanation within the approved storyline of recovery. Each deviation triggered recalibration. The system tightened, then softened, then tightened again. Why adjust if nothing is wrong? Observers began to notice the oscillation. Stability was announced, then questioned, then reaffirmed. The language shifted subtly, from certainty to reassurance, from authority to patience. This fluctuation signaled strain. A mechanism confident in its legitimacy does not need to repeat itself. What was being reinforced so insistently? Sensory accounts from this phase describe a return of intensity. The sharp glare of lights during rare unscripted appearances. The sudden silence after a statement that could not be easily reframed. The physical sensation of breath catching when boundaries were tested. These were not breakdowns. They were awakenings, brief, costly, and quickly contained. Internally, awareness sharpened. Patterns once endured became legible. The mind, long trained to self-monitor, began to question the watcher. Paranoia shifted direction, not inward but outward. The question was no longer, "What is wrong with me?" but "Why does this feel designed?" That shift, though quiet, was dangerous. The response was procedural. Reviews, assessments, renewed justifications. Each action framed as precaution, yet collectively defensive. The system could not allow uncertainty to spread. Doubt, once shared, multiplies. How many others had passed through similar corridors, accepted similar terms, learned the same silence? By now, the public sensed something unresolved. Sympathy returned, cautious and conditional. Official statements emphasized compassion while avoiding specifics. Transparency remained selective. When explanations grow vague, what are they protecting? These cracks did not dismantle the structure. They revealed it. And revelation, even without immediate consequence, alters the balance of power. If a mechanism must hide to function, what happens when it is finally seen? What, exactly, was the system afraid would happen next? The endings were never announced. They did not arrive with verdicts or confessions, only with subtle shifts that allowed the public to believe resolution had occurred. Restrictions eased selectively. Appearances became less controlled. Statements suggested autonomy had returned. Suggested, but never confirmed. Closure, in this context, was performative. For Britney, moments of regained voice surfaced after years of containment, yet the record remained fragmented. What was restored appeared partial, conditional, negotiated. For Amanda, withdrawal from the public eye was framed as healing, though the terms of that healing were never clearly defined. Absence became its own explanation. When silence is interpreted as recovery, who benefits from not asking more? The system did not collapse. It receded. Like any structure designed to avoid scrutiny, it adapted by becoming less visible. Authority was redistributed, oversight renamed, mechanisms refined. Officially, there was nothing left to investigate. Unofficially, the patterns remained intact, waiting for the next activation. What lingers is not proof, but residue. Familiar language reused in unfamiliar cases. Rapid interventions justified by concern. Autonomy questioned at moments of inconvenience. These elements did not disappear with individual outcomes. They persisted, embedded in procedure, normalized by precedent. If a mechanism survives its subjects, was it ever about them? Sensory memory endures where documentation fails. The cold weight of forms, the careful tone of voices that never quite answered questions, the sensation of being managed rather than helped. These experiences do not vanish when control loosens. They recalibrate trust. They teach caution. They remain. Years later, when asked to explain what happened, neither story fits cleanly into categories of abuse or care. The truth sits uncomfortably between them. Intervention occurred. Harm occurred. Intentions were declared. Consequences were absorbed. The system insists these facts can coexist without contradiction. Can they? There is no final revelation, only an unresolved recognition. Two lives, different trajectories, shaped by the same invisible logic. Whether that logic exists to protect or to possess depends entirely on who is speaking and who is being spoken for. The public moved on. Headlines faded. New stories replaced old ones. Yet the question does not disappear simply because attention does. If the mechanism is still in place, refined and unchallenged, then this was not an anomaly. It was a rehearsal. And the next name, when it appears, will not sound unfamiliar.